The courtroom was heavy, with formality-polished wooden benches, flags perfectly draped, and the gavel resting like a symbol of finality. Lawyers in sharp suits whispered strategies, clerks shuffled papers, and the judge sat high on the bench, his robes pristine, his eyes sharp with quiet arrogance. Then she walked in. Aisha, she wore a simple pastel scarf and a plain shalwar kameez, her steps soft but steady. She held a small leather folder close to her chest, eyes composed but unassuming. She wasn't accompanied by lawyers or aides, just herself as she approached the front. Murmurs stirred among the seated attorneys. "Who's that? She doesn't look like she belongs here. It's probably lost. Or maybe a petitioner with no counsel." Judge, an older man known for his impatience, peered over his glasses. His expression tightened when he saw her modest clothes, her quiet demeanor. He chuckled under his breath before speaking. "And you are?" "We don't have time for lost souls today." A few people chuckled in the back. Aisha remained composed, her voice calm but clear. "I'm here to observe the proceedings on the civil rights docket, Your Honor." The judge leaned back with a smug grin, observing. "Dressed like you're here to dust the place, not to learn from it." The chuckles grew louder. Aisha's face remained still, but her eyes sharpened quietly, deeply. She could have walked out, but instead she waited for the right moment, because what the judge, the lawyers, and the entire courtroom didn't know yet was exactly who she was. And soon, the entire room would fall silent, not from her voice, but from the truth she was about to reveal. The judge smirked, tapping his gavel lightly, as if to punctuate his mockery. "If you're here to observe, there's a public gallery upstairs. The space is for professionals." Aisha simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She stepped back, her gaze sweeping the courtroom not with anger, but with quiet resolve. She took a seat at the very back, blending in once again. But her silence wasn't submission, it was patience. The judge resumed the session, but the energy in the room had shifted. Some of the younger attorneys glanced back at Aisha, curiosity replacing their earlier amusement. There was something in her stillness, the way she carried herself, that didn't fit their assumptions. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, a black car pulled up quietly to the private judicial entrance. The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped out, tall, composed, a presence that commanded instant respect. It was Justice Hassan, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Unscheduled, unexpected. The clerks outside the chamber froze, whispers rising. "He's here." Why would the Chief Justice come without prior notice? No one had an answer, but they knew better than to question it. Inside, the session continued until the side door opened discreetly, and in walked the Chief Justice himself. The judge, seeing his superior, stood instantly, as did everyone else. "Your Lordship," the judge stammered. "We weren't expecting," but Justice Hassan raised a hand, silencing him gently. "I'm here on a personal matter." His eyes scanned the room, and then rested on Aisha sitting quietly at the back. He smiled, and then, with all the weight of his title, he said, "I'm here for my wife." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge's face drained of color. The woman he had just mocked, belittled for her simplicity, was the Chief Justice's wife. And in that moment, everyone knew the room had just turned inside out. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Every whisper, every rustle of paper had vanished, leaving only the weight of realization. The judge, who moments ago had chuckled at Aisha's presence, stood frozen behind the bench, his eyes darting between her and the Chief Justice. Aisha stood gracefully from her seat. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence now spoke louder than any protest she could have made. She walked calmly to where her husband stood, her composure unshaken. Justice Hassan's eyes carried pride, but also disappointment, not at his wife, but at the room that had so easily disrespected her. The judge tried to recover. "My lord, I didn't know." Justice Hassan raised his hand, stopping him. "That's precisely the problem. You didn't care to know. You looked at a person and decided her worth by what she wore and how she carried herself. You forgot the dignity that every individual is owed in this court." The words struck harder than any gavel. The entire room hung on his every syllable. Aisha stood quietly by his side, her eyes soft yet firm. She hadn't come to wield power, but to remind them all respect was not a privilege granted by titles, but a right owed to every human being. The Chief Justice continued, his voice echoing with authority. "My wife came to observe, not to flaunt her place, that she was met with mockery in the very place where justice is meant to reside." Around the courtroom, the attorneys who had chuckled now stood with heads lowered, some ashamed, others speechless. The young clerks looked on with wide eyes, witnessing a lesson they would never forget. The judge's face remained pale. He tried again. "Please, your lordship, allow me to—" But again, Justice Hassan interrupted with a calm finality. "No more words, Judge. Let your actions repair the dignity you so carelessly trampled." And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place of lut, became a place of reckoning. Justice Hassan stepped further into the courtroom, his presence making the air feel heavier with each stride. His gaze swept the room, settling not only on the judge, but on every attorney, clerk, and spectator present. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," he said, his voice steady and commanding, "but to remind every person in this room that justice begins with how we treat others, not just when they stand trial, but when they simply stand before us." Aisha remained by his side, her face calm but resolute. She hadn't uttered a single sharp word, yet her silence made the loudest statement in that courtroom. The judge swallowed hard. "Your lordship, Mrs. Hassan, I was careless. I judged without thought." Justice Hassan nodded. "Yes, you did. And if this is how you treat a guest in open court, how many others have you dismissed without listening, without respect?" No one spoke. The lawyers who had chuckled earlier shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding Aisha's gaze altogether. Justice Hassan turned to his wife. "Aisha, would you like to speak?" She shook her head gently. "There's nothing I need to add. Your words are enough. I didn't come here for apologies. I came to observe, and now I've observed more than I intended." Her voice was soft, but every person felt its weight. Justice Hassan addressed the judge one final time. "Let this be your reminder. This robe does not elevate you above dignity, it binds you to it." With that, he nodded to his wife. They turned and walked out together, their steps measured, dignified, unhurried. No one dared speak until the grand wooden doors closed behind them, but the echo of that moment sat engraved in the walls of that courtroom. Lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet power of presence. The aftermath of that day rippled far beyond the walls of the courtroom. By the afternoon, whispers of what had transpired reached other judges, legal clerks, and law students across the city. News spread through chambers and offices. The Chief Justice's wife had been disrespected, and not because anyone knew who she was, but because no one cared to see beyond her appearance. But for Aisha, life returned to its quiet rhythm. She didn't seek attention. She didn't grant interviews. She returned to her daily routines, her simple attire unchanged, her humility untouched. Yet everywhere she went, things felt different. Court clerks greeted her with deference they hadn't before. Lawyers nodded respectfully. Even the most stoic judges remembered her face, how silently she had endured, and how gracefully she had let the truth speak for her. Meanwhile, the judge who had mocked her faced scrutiny, not by official inquiry, but by the court of conscience. His colleagues watched him differently. His own staff, once amused by his sharp tongue, now carried a quiet shame when they looked at him. He issued a formal apology to Justice Hassan and to Aisha, letter filled with remorse. But he knew some wrongs could not simply be erased by words. Inspired by that day, the judiciary introduced a new policy: mandatory dignity training for all judges and court personnel. Not because of Aisha's status, but because justice demanded more than intellect, demanded humanity. Aisha never asked for these changes. She didn't need credit. What mattered to her was that the next person who entered that courtroom dressed in simplicity. Carrying no title would be treated with respect, because real justice, she believed, begins long before the verdict is read. It begins the moment a person walks through the door. Weeks later, Aisha returned quietly to the same courthouse knot as the Chief Justice's wife. Not as a figure everyone whispered about, but simply as herself. She sat in the public gallery once more, her presence unnoticed by many, but this time, something had changed. Judges entered with a different kind of awareness. Court staff greeted every visitor with courtesy, regardless of how they looked. Lawyers who might have once judged someone by their clothing instead focused on their words, and Aisha watched, a gentle smile on her face. She had not raised her voice that day. She hadn't demanded respect, yet the courtroom had remembered her, not as a woman connected to power, but as the one who had exposed their biases without bitterness, without spectacle, just truth. When Justice Hassan joined her that afternoon, he leaned closer and whispered, "They still talk about that day." Aisha smiled softly. "Hey, good. Maybe now they'll think twice before deciding who deserves respect." Outside the courtroom, the judge, who had once mocked her, now worked with a humility he hadn't known before. Every time he saw a simple face in the courtroom, He remembered the day his assumptions shattered and the quiet woman who had taught him a lesson no gavel could enforce. Because in the house of justice, dignity is not worn, it is given. Aisha had shown the world that the quietest presence can hold the greatest power, not by claiming authority, but by reminding everyone that respect should never come with conditions.